Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my December wrap-up. And obviously this is the final wrap-up of 2019. I will do a like bookish stats video thing at some point, and I'll let you know more about kind of my overall year's reading, but I did manage to read 109 books in 2019, and 12 of those were in the month of December. And part of the reason why I read a lot in December is because of the Christmas break. I tend to read a lot over Christmas when I'm home with my family. We're a big family of readers, and the majority of these books I did read over that like 2-week period, which is a little bit crazy. First book that I read in December is one I've been meaning to read for ages, since it came out in 2018, I think. And this is a super hyped book, and for me it did live up to the hype, although I didn't love it as much as I think a lot of other people do, but it was a solid 4-star read for me. This is Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Nian. So this is a YA fantasy, and it features a relationship between two women who are kind of women of the peasant class, of the paper class, and they are essentially forced to become concubines to the Demon King, who is horrible and awful, especially because he's forcing women to be his concubines. So these two women sort of meet under these circumstances and they fall in love, and our main character is Lee, and we kind of follow her perspective, and Ren is one of the other women who have been picked to be concubines. There are 9 of them. So I really enjoyed this book. I liked it a lot. I do think that it was a little hard for me to get into initially. I think the pacing at the beginning was a little bit off. I set it down for about a month at one point, and then I picked it up again, and I kind of had to force my way into the book, but once I hit like 100 pages or so, the story really got going, which I really liked. But I do think that that kind of dampened my expectations a little bit of this book from the get-go. I really loved Ren. Ren's an amazing character. She's just like the best. And I liked Lee, but it is funny because Lee is our first-person narrator, and for some reason I couldn't connect as much with her as I could with Ren and with some of the other girls. So this was kind of a funny one. I feel like I read this like 10 years ago. I don't know why. December feels so far off. It's the 5th of January today. So I can't remember a huge amount and go into detail, but I did enjoy this book. As I said, it's a 4-star read for me, and I do have a copy of the second book, which is Girls of Storm and Shadow, and I am definitely going to be picking that up soon. My next book was one of my most highly anticipated books of 2019, and this is funny because I liked it a lot. It's another 4-star read for me. However, I was expecting it to be a 5-star read for a lot of reasons. This is Starsight by Brandon Sanderson. So Brandon Sanderson is one of my favorite authors, as I think he is for a lot of people on Fantasy BookTube, and this is the second book in his YA sci-fi series, and I loved Skyward so much. It was one of my best books of 2018. I was totally blown away by how much I loved it. And I really enjoyed Starsight, but I feel like a lot of the charm from Skyward wasn't necessarily in this book, because for me what I enjoyed from Skyward was her sort of not only being humbled a little bit, but creating these relationships and making these friends in this really tight-knit group. And although this book does mirror that in a lot of ways, for some reason it just didn't click with me as much. So this series follows a girl named Spensa, and she wants to be a starfighter pilot. She and the humans that she lives with have been kind of stranded on this planet, and they're basically not only kept there by the Krell, this kind of alien race who are constantly attacking. They can't leave the planet, but they are also being kind of constantly bombarded in more and more aggressive attacks by the Krell. They're trying to wipe them out. So Spensa ends up, through many different trials, getting into flight school, and she has to learn to become a pilot, which is what her father had done, and there's a lot of backstory there, and it's a really sweet, fun book. I really enjoyed Skyward. So this continues the adventure, and for some reason maybe the shine wore off a little bit for me. Maybe the new kind of, because we get a little bit of a new setting in this book, maybe that didn't work. I don't really know. I still really enjoyed the hell out of this book. It was a slog in the middle though, and I really struggled to get through the middle bits, but the beginning and the end I really enjoyed. I'm still looking forward to continuing on with this series, but It was a 4-star read for me, which is fantastic, which is great, but I was expecting it to be a favorite book of 2019, and it just wasn't. The next book that I have is the finale of a series. It's one that I've been wanting to read for a really long time. I finally finished up His Dark Materials with the Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman in December. So this is the last book, as I say, in His Dark Materials. I'm super, super happy that I finally got around to reading this. I never read this as a child, and I feel like I did kind of miss out. I really, really enjoy this series. Overall, it's a 4-star series for me. This book was also a 4-star read for me, and I don't want to talk about what happens in this book because it's the last book in a trilogy, but I really enjoy all of the characters' development, especially Lyra's, and I really enjoyed the ending. I just thought that this was really, really fun. I would highly recommend the audiobooks if you are thinking about potentially reading or rereading this series. It's a full cast audiobook, and while it was really weird to get used to, I thought that the audiobook was great. It's narrated by Philip Pullman, and he does a great job. So if you are interested in reading these, I could not recommend them more highly. I need to catch up on the BBC show. Next up, I have one of my most highly anticipated releases of 2020, and I was lucky enough to read this early. I was so pumped to read The Shadow Saint by Gareth Hanrahan. If you have seen my Best Books of 2019 video, you know that The Gutter Prayer, the first book in this series, tied for first place for my absolute favorite book of 2019. So of course I was really excited to get my hands on a copy of the sequel. And this book is really great, and it feels like it's not a traditional sequel in some ways, and it was so brilliantly done. It was just so good. So this series takes place in a city called Guerdon, and it is a neutral city in the God War, which is exactly what it sounds like. So in the first book, we have all these crazy events, these 3 kind of storylines that branch off and come back together, and we have a big event at the end of that book. In The Shadow Saint, it takes place about a few months after the kind of big events of The Gutter Prayer, and we follow 3 new storylines. There are other points of view in this book, but there are really 3 main ones. One is a spy who has been sent from another land into Guerdon as a spy for the God War. Then we have a kind of washed up younger son of the nobility of another land, a land of kind of necromancy, which is so awesome. And he is the younger brother of the ambassador to Guerdon, and so he shows up. And then our final character who gets a point of view is Elidora, who's my favorite. She's so amazing. And she is a side character in The Gutter Prayer, and she gets her own sort of main point of view focus in this book, and she is helping with the election campaigning for Parliament. So it takes about 150 pages for these storylines to slowly start to merge together, and I had no idea like what people's motivations and stuff were initially. I was just kind of going with the flow of the story because a lot is revealed very slowly, but in a really, really brilliant way. I thought that this was an incredible book, super satisfying. I loved it. It's a 5-star read for me. I just adore these books so much. I love his writing style, and I love his characters, and I love his world building. So the next book that I have is one that I read on my Kindle. It was an advance copy of a book that comes out at the end of January of this year. This is Prosper's Demon by KJ Parker. Now, Prosper's Demon I think is a funny one because it's a novella, so it's short. It has an incredible cover, as you guys can see, which completely drew me in. And it has the most amazing sounding premise. It's basically about a nameless narrator who is an exorcist. He's kind of an asshole. He doesn't have a lot of empathy for the people who have been possessed, who he's, exorcising the demons from. And he ends up discovering that one of the kind of most prominent philosophers and important figures in this land is possessed. And so it's funny. Okay, so the narrator's amazing. He's a total asshole. He's so morally dubious, and I just adored him. He's super snarky and sarcastic, and he's great. He's basically my perfect kind of narrator. I really loved the story of this book, and I really loved a lot of kind of the banter and interactions, but because this is a novella, it's a little bit funny. It does a lot of sort of waxing lyrical about philosophy and art and, you know, the construction of this particular statue, which plays into the plot and everything. And because it's a novella, it felt like that was taking up a lot of space, and I do feel like I've never read anything by KJ Parker before, so I don't know if this is their style or not, but it felt like it was just taking up a lot of space that could have been better served by actual plot. So while I really enjoyed this book, I had a great time reading it, I totally ripped through it because it was short and it was fun. I feel like there were a lot of places where I think it could have been improved for the expectations of the reader, because if you look, I'll link all of these down below, but if you look at the description of the book, what you get is not necessarily what they tell you you're gonna get. And so while I did enjoy it, it wasn't, basically I'm trying to justify my 3.5-star rating for this book, because I did enjoy it, it just wasn't, I don't think that it did what it said on the tin. Basically. I can't explain my feelings here. After Prosperous Demon, I read Nemesis by Agatha Christie. This is my very first Miss Marple book, because while I love Agatha Christie, I have only read And Then There Were None, which is not with a specific detective, and a bunch of Poirot books, and I love Poirot. I had never given Miss Marple a try before, and I have to say I'm really glad I started with this one, because Nemesis is amazing. So I think I've actually been misselling this book every time I've talked about it. I've talked about it in like my, I think, December TBR and then my Christmas TBR. I think I might have made a mistake every time I describe this book, so my apologies. But basically, this book follows Miss Marple, our detective, our elderly, kind of lightly grouchy lady detective, and she receives a letter in the post from solicitors, and she is basically told that this very wealthy man who she met a year previously basically on holiday, and they solved a murder together, has passed away. He's died, and he wants to employ her to investigate something, and we don't know what that something is. Listeners don't know what that something is. Miss Marple doesn't know what that something is, but she's so intrigued by this mystery and by this puzzle that she decides to take it on. So I initially thought that she was solving his murder. That's not the case. She is solving a different crime, and she basically doesn't know what the crime was. She doesn't know who the victims are, she doesn't know who the suspects are, she doesn't know anything about it, and she has to kind of follow this very sparse trail of clues that this man has left her. And it was really good. I thought it was just fantastic. It's funny seeing the difference between Poirot and Miss Marple, because while they are both very shrewd detectives, Miss Marple is like, she's a harsh lady. She is tough. And Poirot is great, and I love him and everything. But she was not what I was expecting, and that was really awesome. So if you're going to read any Agatha Christie, if you've not read any Miss Marple, I would highly recommend Nemesis. It's super fun. I'm definitely going to dive into more Miss Marple books and continue on my Agatha Christie reading. In a sharp left turn from fantasy and from murder, I ended up reading a middle grade book this month, and it was a delight, which I'm not surprised about because this is actually a sequel to one of my favorite books from last year. This is Tilly and the Lost Fairy Tales, the second book in the Pages & Co. series by Anna James. This series follows a girl named Matilda, or Tilly, who lives in a bookshop called Pages & Co. that is run by her grandparents in London. And in the first book, she discovers that she is a book wanderer and her grandparents are book wanderers. So she can basically wander into a book, interact with everything that is happening in that book, and she can also pull characters out. So she's good friends with Anne from Anne of Green Gables and Alice in Wonderland, which is just like the best thing ever. So in the second book, she goes to Paris, which is fabulous, with her friend from the first one, and she gets tangled up in the world of fairy tales, and it's just such a delight. It's so fun. These books are amazing, and because I know that you all are as shallow as me and you love a good cover, it has this really sweet design under the cover, and it has lovely kind of not necessarily, they are illustrations, there are actual illustrations, but like decorations on the page and stuff. They're just beautiful books, and they're so sweet, and they're just perfect for book lovers. So I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely adored it. I really like Tilly. I love her friendship with Oscar. I love her relationship with her grandparents. They're just wonderful. They're just really, really nice books. So unfortunately, the next book that I read I did not particularly enjoy, and it's kind of a funny one because I didn't particularly enjoy the first book, but I had really high hopes for the second one. This is The Night Country by Melissa Albert. So I read The Hazelwood in 2018, I think, over the summer, and I loved the first half of it. The first half of it is great and brilliant, and then the book completely and totally magically fell apart for me in the second half. So because I liked that first half, and I like her writing, it's a little bit frilly, but I like her writing, so I decided to go ahead and read The Night Country as well. And unfortunately, the exact same freaking thing happened. I can't believe it. The first half was pretty good, and then the second half just crumbled for me. I don't know what it is about her books or her style or whatever, but this was just really puzzling. So the series follows a girl named Alice, and Alice and her mother have kind of been on the run from their bad luck for pretty much her entire life. And it sounds completely unrelated, but Alice's grandmother is this sort of cult writer figure who wrote a book called Tales from the Hinterland, which is a collection of really, 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 really super dark fairy tales. So she begins seeing these kind of fairy tale creatures pop up in New York City, and then the story kind of falls apart from there. So in the second book, we follow the events of the first one. So I'm not going to say a huge amount about it, but some of my issues with this book had to do with, I like her writing style, I really do, but I do think that she's very guilty in this book of using a lot of words to say not very much. This book could have been like chopped in half, which is not ideal. She says the same things over and over and over again, and while there is an interesting sort of overarching plot, which is spoilery, so if you've read The Hazelwood and you want to check out what the plot of this one is, it's linked down below. But I feel like there were stakes, but there was no sense of urgency, and there was no sense that the plot was important. You know what I mean? So that was a big problem. And then also at the very end, I feel like it just turned into her trying to mash two different books together into one. And it just didn't work. It goes from being in the entire first half one perspective, and then in the second half she alternates perspectives. It's just bizarre. It just didn't work for me, unfortunately. I really wanted to like this book. I really want to love her books because they, in theory, sound so amazing, but it just didn't happen for me. I ended up giving The Night Country 2 out of 5 stars. It's an unfortunate rating for a upcoming release, but it's just, we gotta be honest here. So I think if you really loved The Hazelwood, you'll probably enjoy The Night Country. But if you're like me and are hoping that it kind of improves from the first half being great and the second half not being great, I wouldn't bother. The next book that I read was amazing. There was another end to a trilogy, and like this made me sob on the sofa over Christmas. And fortunately I have a really understanding family, so they just kind of like gently tucked a blanket over me, handed me Nora the dog, and were just like, maybe you should read something a little bit less heartbreaking next. This is Tangled Assassins by R.J. Barker. So if you have seen my Best Books of 2019 video, you probably know that the entire Wounded Kingdom series made that list, and this is my favorite of that series. It's just so phenomenal and wonderful, and it is one of the best examples I can think of an overarching story and character arc that just is executed perfectly. Again, it's the third book in a series, so I'm not going to go into what this book is about because it is mega spoilers, but the series follows one character named Girton, and he, at the very beginning, he's probably a teenager, and he is an apprentice assassin, and in that first book, he and his master, whose name is Marilla, are basically hired on to protect the heir to the throne from assassination. So they're not assassins assassinating, they're assassins stopping assassinations from happening, which is great. So the second book, I think, is 5 years later, and this one is probably about 10 to 20 years later. I believe he's in his 30s in this book. And the growth of the characters, I won't say who, but there's one character I would not in a million years have imagined that I would love this person, because they are the absolute freaking worst in the first book, but by the end they're like my all-time favorite character ever. I loved Girton's growth. I loved Marilla, his master. RJ is really good at writing older women, which I think is just fantastic for fantasy because you don't see it very often, and these books are just so good. If you like kind of bleak, low fantasy, you must pick these up. They're so just incredible. And as I say, one of the best complete story arcs I've ever read. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. It's so good. After that, I went for 2 shorter books. I read 2 novellas to round out my reading for the month. So the very first one was The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This is the novella that the second longest running play in the UK is based on. The Woman in Black is an amazing play. I've seen it a few times now, and it's just incredible. If you get the chance to go, it's just great. It's always running somewhere. So this is a very spooky ghost story, very chilling, and I'm a huge wimp, so take that with a grain of salt, but whatever. It was written in the 80s, and it takes place kind of at turn of the century England, and our main character is a young kind of up-and-coming solicitor, and he is sent up to the English countryside to this creepy abandoned house because the owner, who has very much lived in isolation for the majority of her life, I believe, has passed away, and he has to get her affairs in order because he's her solicitor. So he arrives at this village, and everyone is super cagey about this house and about this woman. No one will tell him what's going on, but it's obvious that they are frightened of something. And our main character begins to see this strange, kind of spooky woman all dressed in black sort of lurking about. And it's very, very, very good. It's super short. This copy is just over 200 pages. It's one you can absolutely blast through. I'd recommend it for obviously the fall, for Halloween time, but also for the winter because it takes place in winter. The book opens on Christmas Eve, and I loved it. I thought that it was just brilliant. So I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I'm definitely going to be seeking out more books by Susan Hill. She writes police procedurals, I believe, and also ghost stories. And the second novella that I read was All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is the very first book in the Murderbot series of novellas. This was actually a reread for me. I read this for the first time in 2018, and I think I 3-starred it at the time. I really wanted to love it because I love the concept and I really enjoyed Murderbot as a character, but for whatever reason it just didn't click with me. But lately there has been a lot of excitement for the Murderbot books because this is a series of 4 novellas. However, there's going to be a full-length novel published in May. So it's been on my mind a lot lately, so I asked for these for Christmas, and I ended up reading this over Christmas, and I really, really enjoyed it. So the Murderbot Diaries basically follows a kind of humanoid security unit. They have organic human parts and basically inorganic parts. I want to call them like a cyborg or an android, but I don't really know what I should call them. But they're a security unit, and basically they have hacked their governor module, which is what regulates their behavior and ensures that they are kind of under strict control by the company that owns them. So our main character has hacked their module, essentially gained sentience and a sense of free will, and all they want to do is download lots of media, watch their favorite TV shows, and just desperately wishes the humans would stop getting themselves into dumb and difficult situations. It was so fun. I really enjoyed this when I read it the second time. I don't know why I didn't like it the first time around. Maybe I wasn't in the sci-fi mood. Maybe it's because I've been thinking about this a lot. Maybe it's because I feel like a lot of people talk about how funny this book is. And it does definitely have its moments of humor and being really light, but it is definitely like a hard sci-fi book. So I don't know if my expectations when I read it the first time were quite in line with what the book actually is. However, upon a reread, I ended up really enjoying this, and this is one of the reasons why I have decided to try to reread more books in 2020, which is not something I typically do. My reread of All Systems Red made me raise it from a 3-star definitely to a solid 4 stars, and I have actually in January read the second book. I am planning on finishing out the series and reading the novel when it comes out later this year. And I actually forgot about one. I forgot I read a graphic novel. I was hoping that I could read 110 books. I didn't quite get the second Murderbot book done in time, but this one brought me to 109. This is The Wicked and the Divine by Gillian McKelvey. This is really interesting because I think that with a wider scope and being able to read more, because this is just a single volume, I think that it would make a lot more sense, because I did enjoy it. This was a 4-star read for me as well. But I think that kind of getting one of the huge bind-ups or something like that, reading one of those, would make the story make a little bit more sense, because they don't really hold your hand in this one. So in this story, every 90 years, the gods of all cultures are reborn on Earth, and they kind of inhabit human bodies. They hang about and do their thing for 2 years. Many of them are kind of pop stars and performers, and they have this incredible sort of opulent lifestyle. And then their human hosts die, and they kind of go and rest again until the next 90 years comes along. And this follows a girl whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. And she is basically a huge fangirl of the gods, and she ends up sort of getting mixed up in their business. I don't want to spoil too much of this. I really enjoyed it. I love the artwork. The artwork is just wonderful. It's really beautiful. It complements the story really well, and I don't always love graphic novels. I sometimes struggle because you don't have as many words as you can get in, say, a regular full-length novel. However, I did really enjoy this story. I want to read more. I want to learn more about this world, and I gave this 4 stars, as I say. So I'm very much looking forward to going ahead and exploring the rest of these. I think it's a completed series. I think it's a bit older. I think it's like 2014 or 2015. So I'm very intrigued to find out what happens next and kind of get a full view of what the story is. So that is it for my December reading wrap-up. My December reading was really good, although we did have some ups and downs. I did read some incredible books. I read some of my best books of 2019, and I think that I started the year off on a really good foot. So in the comments below, I would love to know what you read in the month of December, what your favorite books of December were. Also, if you've read any of these books and if they're in your TBR, let me know. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.